everyone, good afternoon, and welcome again for the second part of the FGM protection orders webinar, a breach-legal remedy to be rolled out in other EU countries. So it is organized by the FGM European Network, the University of Cambridge, and then the Department of Sociology, and then Heidelberg Consultancy, Human Rights Law Consultancy. So yes, maybe I know that you all participated or were interested in the previous webinar. So this is just a bit of a recap from last time. Who we are. So the FGM European Network, we are a network of 30 organizations in 14 European countries. We work towards a comprehensive European response to ending FGM and to supporting survivors in Europe and beyond. And so we're very interested in cooperating with our colleagues today to really ensure that we have a more homogeneous treatment and protection tools for women and girls in Europe. So I will not present further because I'm sure you will know it, and if you don't, just go on our website and you will find more. But yeah, so as we were saying, this is the second part of our first webinar that we held, I think mid-June, so 3 weeks ago, more or less. And that was really a very informative webinar. I hope you enjoyed, or you saw the recording that we put online and we shared with you as well. But it was really it gave really a very comprehensive overview from many different perspectives on what are FGM protection orders in the UK. So just to recap maybe the speakers that were present last time, and then also will be available today to answer any of your questions after a bit of a recap, 15 minutes recap. But so just to show a bit the speakers that were last time. So Dr. Charlotte Brodman, she's a barrister at the Goldsmith Chambers and a junior research fellow at Queen's College in Cambridge. And so she gave her perspective as a barrister, and she introduced the purpose of FGMPOs, the history, statistics, and examples in the case law. Then last time we also had Gillian Squires. She is from the perspective of a police officer, so she's with the West Midlands Police, and she's really an expert on FGM and on the police response to this at UK level. And then we had Leif Norton from the National FGM Centre in London, and he is a social worker, and he works as head of the National FGM Centres, which is a partnership between Barnardo's and the UK's largest between Barnardo's and the UK's largest charity and the local government association, to bring system change and to help ending FGM and protecting children and girls survivors. So he gave the perspective of a social worker, and he really explained how does the FGMPOs are applied in practice. Then we had the intervention of Emi Abdushaid from Forward UK. She brought the perspective, so she's a specialist in behavioral insights and impact evaluation and of health interventions, and she gave the perspectives of a community study that was done by Forward UK, and finally we had the intervention of Dr. Anne-Marie Middelberg, who is an independent consultant and lecturer at the University of Amsterdam, and she brought us a bit more into the European perspective, giving an overview of how other countries deal with the protection of FGM survivors or people at risk, and she encouraging, let's say, a more harmonization across the EU. So this is, and then I was moderator, so I'm Chiara from the FGM European Network. I'm head of policy and advocacy. What is going to happen today? So today, what we thought would be very interesting would be to have a short recap of last time, so of what are FGMPOs and how do they work in practice, done by Dr. Charlotte Prudman. And then we will have free time. We would want to give time for Q&A and for debate session that would be moderated by Dr. Anne-Marie Wilderberg and myself in case needed. And so you will really be able to ask questions to the speakers. They are all present today. So it will be a very important interactive session. And then we will have a debate on some questions, ensuring really that we bring this perspective of the FGMPOs in other countries. So really we want to hear from you how it works, how it could be improved, and it could be applied to your country context and so on. So this will really be more interactive after an initial recap from Dr. Charlotte Prudman. So without further ado, I pass the floor to Dr. Prudman to give us a recap on what FGM protection orders are. Thank you very much, Charlotte.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chiara. So I'm going to provide a very short overview of FGM protection orders, of course, in Britain, given that this is currently the only jurisdiction where FGM protection orders are enforced. So for those that have already attended, I'm recapping on the presentation that was provided before. And for those that are new, I hope this provides a helpful introduction to FGM protection orders and the purpose of them. So as we're aware, FGM continues to take place across the EU, and in Britain there is, of course, as in many other countries, a rarity of statistics available. But it's believed that around 103,000 women and girls are living with FGM, and over 60,000 girls are at risk of the practice. In terms of actual data set we have from the NHS, between 2015 and 2019, there were 45,000 attendances to health services in England by individuals who had undergone FGM. And apparently that accounted for potentials in duplication of patients that were seen. So it's just simply one patient that has been recorded rather than duplicate numbers of women that may have visited multiple hospitals or doctors. Now, FGM was criminalised in 1985, believe it or not, in the UK, yet there's only been one conviction for the practice. And I think for a range of reasons, of which I'm sure you'll be familiar with as experts in FGM, there are a number of barriers to the implementation of the criminal law, particularly given that the practice is largely performed by family members and is supported by communities, and often performed on girls as well who are voiceless and are not aware that this is something that may not even or should even happen to them. Thank you, Chiara. So the origin of FGM protection orders, well, they were modelled on forced marriage protection orders. So we already have some data and literature about the effectiveness of forced marriage protection orders that were introduced many years ago. And they've been successful in encouraging women in particular, the police, local authorities, family members to come forward to seek what we call an injunction to prevent, in this case, forced marriage from taking place. So rather than it being a criminal remedy, it's preventative. The family court can make these orders to stop this type of behaviour from taking place. Given that forced marriage protection orders were successful, FGM protection orders were then introduced by the government in 2015. And legal aid is available for these remedies, which means the government will pay for your legal representation if you meet the test required. So FGM protection orders, what do they do? Well, they can include a wide range of prohibitions and restrictions to protect a girl from FGM. One of the most common restrictions is the removal of the passport of the girl, so to prevent her from being taken abroad. A port alert can be implemented, which means that authorities will be notified if a girl is attempting to be taken abroad to leave the jurisdiction. In some circumstances, and I say this is very rare, medical examinations can be ordered if they think FGM has been performed, or it could be used as a deterrent when returning from overseas to from a high prevalence country to check that a girl hasn't undergone the practice. And it can also include risk assessments that can be carried out by organisations such as the National FGM Centre or Forward, or independent social workers to assess what the risk is in these particular cases. And they've been very helpful, in my opinion, in changing attitudes, beliefs and mindsets of family members that supported FGM. But on speaking directly with social workers over a number of weeks, their attitudes have changed towards the practice. And in fact, even a 180 has occurred where we've seen families that have been either supportive or ambivalent towards FGM then state very publicly that they oppose the practice. And it can prohibit, for example, named respondents, so named individuals, from having contact with the girl who's at risk. So it's a wide range of measures that can be implemented to protect the girl. And in all cases, it will have an end date on the order. So once a final order is made, which means once the order has come, once the case has come to a conclusion, and that could take a year, it could take a lot less than that. Sometimes it can be dealt with in a matter of months or weeks. But once the case has come to a conclusion, there will be an end date on the order. So it will say this order will run for 2 years, or until the girl attains the age of 16, or whenever it might be, depending on the risks that are prevalent, but there's always an end date. And of course, regardless of what that end date is, it's open to anyone that's named on the order, whether it's the girl or the family, to bring the matter back to court to vary or discharge the order. And if they make the test, they'll get legal aid to do so. Breach of an order is a criminal offence, but it's only a criminal offence if it's breached, and it's conduct that you shouldn't be engaging in any event. And it's important to note that these orders relate to conduct outside of England and Wales, as well as within the country. So it can, for example, include measures that are supposed to prohibit conduct, for instance, in Sudan or Ethiopia or other countries where this behaviour is not supposed to be taking place. Whether those orders are actually effective in other jurisdictions is a different question, and can be dealt with sometimes by family judge liaison officers abroad. Now, I have seen this work, particularly in child abduction cases, with the registering an order, for example, in Lagos, in the High Court in Lagos, and that's been effective. And so there is scope for making sure that it involves conduct outside of England, Wales, and is registered. And I'd just say on this point that it's very relevant to what we're discussing today, because if FGM protection orders are introduced in other member states, other EU countries, then potentially that would mean FGM protection orders are automatically enforceable in other countries. So at the moment, if you get an FGM protection order in this country and you try and register it, say in Belgium or France, there's no guarantee that the courts would register it, because there's no comparable legal remedy in those countries. So it can result in a haphazard approach. And if there are family members in those particular countries where the risk is considered to be heightened, it's important that the order is registered in those countries. So just very briefly, in terms of what the Act actually says, looking at subsection 2, highlighted in red, I think it's important just to remember that the court must have regard to all the circumstances, including the need to secure the health, safety and well-being of the girl to be protected. So there's no threshold in terms of an FGM protection order being granted, meaning that it's not particularly high, or even low. There's no threshold that's enshrined in legislation. It's a case of looking at the case on its facts, and each case is fact specific. But it's important to distinguish between FGM protection orders and care proceedings. And I really want to emphasize that point. So if you listen to nothing else I say in this very short presentation, please take away the fact that FGM protection orders are not care proceedings, which means that the state, so local authorities, children's services, cannot remove a child from your care, from a parent's care, under an FGM protection order. That cannot happen. It's a completely different legal remedy to do that, as it will be in any other child neglect or abuse case. This is simply to prohibit FGM from taking place. So who can apply for the order? It can be a relevant third party, for example, a local authority or the police, or anyone with leave of the court. So if you apply for permission to make the order, and the court grants it because, for example, you're a mother or a father or an aunt, then the court will deal with it. And in many cases that I've worked on, it's actually been the parents that have applied for FGM protection orders. and they've made the application for the orders because they don't support FGM, but they know that their family do support FGM, and they know or believe that they'll be put under a lot of pressure by their family to have the girls cut when they go on their family holiday. And so they've applied for the order to try and put pressure on family members not to engage in FGM. And in terms of the statistics, from 2015 to 2019, there's been 408 applications and 489 orders in family courts, which is a fair number, and that only includes England and Wales. It doesn't include, for example, Northern Ireland. And for those that say, well, it's fairly insignificant compared to the numbers of girls at risk of FGM, I think this is actually a significant number when we think that there hasn't been huge heightened awareness of FGMPOs. Many local authorities are still reluctant to make applications when they shouldn't be, in some circumstances, leaving girls at risk of the practice. And I think, you know, when one compares these statistics to criminal convictions, and there's only been one, it shows the fact that having a remedy that doesn't impose criminal sanctions is perhaps more successful in engendering change. So just very briefly and finally, a case study just to highlight how FGM protection orders can work. So in this case, a Nigerian mother who was against FGM was concerned that her 16-year-old daughter could be subject to FGM, and she believed that the ex-husband would try to make FGM be performed on her. The mother appropriately referred herself to social care. Local authority decided to take no action. They were impressed by the mother's parenting, but the social worker did think it would help if the mother applied for an FGM protection order. Now, in my view, looking at this without seeing all the facts, it should have been the local authority that applied for the FGM protection order. If they were supporting the application, they should have made the application. But in any event, the mother made the application. It was supported by the local authority. The father contested the FGMPO and said it would affect his career. However, I must emphasise that FGM protection orders are not included, for example, on DBS checks, so what we call police checks when you apply for a job. Having this order granted would not come up on those checks because it's not criminal in nature. And the FGM protection in this case was granted until the girl was 18. The girl went on to college, the mother went on to university. It was successful in ensuring that everyone was protected and the girl felt safe. So I just would like to alert you to this overview here, and Chiara will make sure the slides are available online for you all to look at. But this is a page from the National FGM Centre's guidance on FGM protection orders. I believe it's at page 2. And Chiara again will provide a link to this document, which is very helpful. And it effectively sets out what we've discussed this morning, at the beginning of this afternoon, about what the FGM protection orders, who can apply, why they're important, and what can be included in the orders. So I'm going to hand over now to Chiara and Anne-Marie to have the discussion session. And I'm really interested to learn what legal remedies exist in your country to prevent and deter FGM, and whether you think FGM protection orders could work in your country. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing more from you shortly.
Thank you very, very much, Charlotte. It's actually quite nice that you end with that question, because when you were presenting, I made a poll, and I would like to ask all the participants to have a look at this poll. Do you think it is a good idea to introduce FGMPOs in your country? So perhaps you have joined our first webinar. If not, Charlotte provided a very nice brief summary of what FGMPOs are. And as a starter of the discussion that we have in the next half an hour, I would love to hear from you whether you think, after knowing what FGMPOs are, whether you think it might be a good idea to introduce them in your jurisdictions, in your countries. I see we have a lot of participants from the UK, but there are already 4 people who said, yes, it might be a good idea to introduce that in my country. So not all people have filled in the poll. please feel free to do so. I can't see who fills in what, so it is anonymous. Thank you so much. I end the poll now, and here are the results. So actually, and that is very nice, all the people who are not from the UK and who filled in this poll said it might be a good idea to introduce FGMPOs in my country. Now, feel free, that's what I said already in the chat, feel free to ask any question that you might have to the panelists in the chat box, or you could also use the raise your hand button of Zoom. So do whatever you feel comfortable with. For now, I also had some questions that we couldn't answer during our previous webinar. So during that first webinar, we had quite some questions in the chat box that we couldn't address. So it might be good to start with those. And Charlotte, you already touched upon it in your presentation, but I think there are quite some misunderstandings about FGMPOs. And one of the things is that some people of the first webinar were afraid, or they thought that FGMPOs could lead to removing children from their parents. Could you please reflect on that? Because the first webinar we had the case of Portugal that was shared. I think it's important, again, to emphasize that this could not be a consequence of FGMPOs, and your reflections on that, please.
Yes, thank you, Anna. So I think in the Portuguese case, from my recollection, there was a girl that was at risk of FGM, and it appeared that public authorities took quite a heavy-handed approach and decided to remove the girl from her family, and I can see Chiara nodding. That's in summary. Of course, there are very important details which forgive me for not including at this stage, and perhaps the person that raised the question might want to come back on that. But I think just to emphasize, as I tried to do during my presentation, that FGM protection orders cannot result in a child being removed from their family. To do so, you'd have to instigate care proceedings, and every country that's in the EU does have care proceedings. It's one of the core tenets of being part of the EU, that you would have this provision available, which means that a child that's at risk of neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, can be subject to care proceedings where the state will intervene, and in some cases the children will be put into foster care if there's a risk of significant harm. At least that's how it's defined in England and Wales. So that test of significant harm is not included for obtaining FGM protection orders, because it doesn't need to be. A child is not going to be removed from their family. It's simply a preventative measure, an injunction. So in the case of the Portuguese case, in Portugal they don't have FGM protection orders, but perhaps what would have been an appropriate way forward, without knowing all the facts of course, but just some suggestions, if FGM protection orders were in force in that country, would have been to make an application. So social services, if they were concerned the child was at risk of FGM, to go to the courts in Portugal, get an FGM protection order, and include within the order measures to make sure that, for example, if there's a risk the child will be taken out of the country, to stop the child from being removed until there's a risk assessment by an independent social worker organisation with experience in FGM. So the child will remain with the family while that risk assessment is carried out, because the risk often is the child being removed from their home country. And if that risk can be alleviated with an FGM protection order, then there's no reason to justify a punitive measure or draconian measure like putting the child into foster care, or involving the police even, in terms of looking at criminal remedies. So I think it's just a case of really understanding the fact that FGM protection orders on their own will not result in a child being removed from their family.
Yeah, thank you so much, Charlotte, for that clarification. I think that is indeed very important. We have a question from Anne-Marie Lund. She is a border police officer and would like to know who is contacted at the border to address anyone that an FGMPO has been granted. She says, I encounter travelers coming back, but who is there to stop the passengers traveling out for these procedures to take place? Jill, I saw that you already answered the question in the chat box, but could you please elaborate on your answer and explain, provide an answer to this question? Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thanks for that question. Basically, when the FGM protection order is granted, once it's served, it will be placed on the police national computer. It will also be served on the National Borders Targeting Centre and placed on the Warning Index. So, should you have somebody come to checking, then hopefully it should flag. I mean, I have to say that we are reliant on others informing us that they're going to be travelling, and that some do go because we've got limited checks on the way out of the country, haven't we, where that information might be identified. Does that make sense?
Yes, your internet connection, I think, is a little bit unstable, but I could understand what you were saying. Anne-Marie, does that provide an answer to your question? Otherwise, you could also unmute yourself and pose a follow-up question if you like. Anne-Marie Lund, are you with us? Perhaps it was all clear. I would then, in the meantime, like if you have a follow-up question, Anne-Marie, please let me know, and then I give you the floor. Then I would like to move to the next question from Alex Adams. He asks a question to you, Charlotte. Would you mind just clarifying the legal position where another jurisdiction does not have an FGMPO equivalent? Will enforceability of a UK FGMPO in a foreign jurisdiction depend upon the agreement in place with the UK? I think that's an excellent question. Could you please reflect on that, Charlotte?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Thank you, Alex. It really goes to the heart of what we're discussing today. So it's not only in terms of if there are FGM protection orders that are enforceable in other jurisdictions, that means that their girls who are, for example, Portuguese nationals or French nationals will be protected. But it also means that anyone travelling to those countries from another EU country would also be protected. So I think in terms of this question at the moment, if an FGM protection order is granted in this country, one would hope that it's enforceable in a foreign jurisdiction, but you're absolutely right, Alex, it would depend upon the agreement that's in place with that particular jurisdiction. So in some jurisdictions, there'll be good levels of cooperation between judges and courts, which can assist in making sure that that order is implemented. But it's very difficult if they don't have the corresponding piece of legislation, because they're effectively trying to implement something that's new and doesn't exist in their country. So if it is implemented, it could raise a whole host of questions, for example, right to a fair hearing in another country if there are not those, if there's not, for example, a bilateral treaty, a mutual recognition of that particular remedy, which is why, in my opinion, certainly it's so important for FGM protection orders to be made available in EU member states. I hope it answers your question, Alex.
Jill, you want to react to that as well?
A little bit better now. Is it any better? I just wanted to say that sometimes if we've got children who are out of jurisdiction and the protection order that is raised here in the UK stipulates that somebody, one of the family members or friend, stipulates on order that it's up to them to get the child back into the UK. If they do so, then they're in breach of that order, and therefore a criminal offence, and have no success in getting children back to the country using that process.
Thank you for that clarification. Still, the sound is very is a bit problematic, but I could catch your main point. Thank you for that. There was also a question on how quickly an FGMPO can be granted, and this was also a question that was on my list that was posed during the previous webinar. So what is the average time between a request for an FGMPO and the order being granted? So maybe Charlotte or Jill, could you reflect on that?
So was the question, how long is the procedure for an FGM protection order, Anna?
Yes. The average time between a request for a protection order and the order being granted was the question in the first webinar, and then today we have a webinar. We have a question about, in case of an emergency, how fast can the FGMPO be granted?
So if it's an emergency case, then you can have a hearing within the hour if you need to. You can either go straight to the High Court if it's during open hours, or if it's not, and it's, for example, late in the evening, then you can telephone the urgent judges who are available 24 hours a day, effectively. They're on a rota system, so it can be dealt with on an urgent basis.
A very practical and pragmatic question, but very important to know. I also would like to ask the audience to think about how girls at risk are being protected in your country, in your jurisdictions. So please raise your hand or put in the chat box if you want to take the floor, because we would like to answer your questions in relation to FGMPOs during this follow-up webinar. But we also would like to hear from you, like, how are girls at risk of FGM being protected in your European or non-European countries, since I saw there we have people from Canada and other countries as well. So how are girls protected? Please feel free to share that with us, since it's very important information for us. Now, Amy, are you with us as well? Because perhaps you could also reflect on some of the questions that have been posed. Maybe you could reflect also Forward UK's views on the things that have been discussed in relation to FGMPOs. Maybe you want to say something about your research. Amy, are you with us? I saw you on the list.
Whilst we're waiting for Amy to join us, I can also see Tokes is on the list as well from Forward. And if not, perhaps she could step in.
Yeah, please.
Fantastic work.
I want to give you the opportunity at least.
It's an amazing advocacy. But before perhaps I'll wait for Amy to join, there's an excellent question in the chat box from Amy, a different Amy, who asked a follow-up question to Alex's question. Will the adoption of FGMPOs in other EU jurisdictions be dependent on the type of legislation that bans FGM in those countries, or doesn't that matter? E.g., France compared to UK, and the way FGM is viewed under child protection versus the FGM Act. Thanks, Amy Hearn. Excellent question. And there are two ways to answer this, perhaps, and please feel free, any of the other speakers or experts on the line, to chip in as well, that we're all learning together. But I think the first part is, if an FGM protection order at present is granted in this jurisdiction, so in the UK, and you want to try and register that, for example, in Belgium or France, if family members are based in those countries, it's dependent, yes, on the type of legislation available and whether the judges and courts will cooperate in registering that order, and it'll be very much jurisdiction dependent. And I think the second point is, can FGM protection orders be implemented or adopted, enforced in other EU jurisdictions, which is what we would like to happen. Or I'll speak for myself. I certainly would view that I think it would be tremendous for girls at risk to have FGM protection orders available as a legal remedy in EU member states. And if that was the case, you know, I think obviously the law would better protect them. But I don't think it is necessarily dependent on the legislation that's available in terms of banning FGM, because it's such a distinctive legislation. So I think an argument can be made looking at, for example, some of the duties which Anna spoke about of EU member states to comply with certain provisions, directives, in terms of protecting girls from violence and making sure they have sufficient legal remedies available in these countries, which arguably they don't, because they're not protecting girls and women through civil remedies, not just criminal remedies. So I think there's many arguments that can be made, and perhaps Anna could say a little bit more about what she said last time in terms of the duties of EU member states.
Thank you, Charlotte. That is very interesting indeed. We have a very good question from Edith. She says, I can see it took long for the legislation to kick in the UK. Canada is still at a level of effectively affecting the legislation since 2011. We would like to know how the UK is addressing vacation cutting and control at borders. And I think this is not only a struggle within Canada, but in many other countries. So Charlotte or Jill, could you reflect on that?
I think perhaps Jill would be the best person to answer, because I know she's done some work with Operation Limelight. If Jill's available.
Jill, are you still there?
Hi, yeah, I'm just trying to move to a different part of the house to see if the internet's any better. Is that any better?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, the question is around how is the UK addressing vacation cutting and control at borders?
Yes,
in terms of vacation cutting, we run an operation called Operation Limelight, which is an operation which we run generally before school holidays and at the end of school holidays, speaking to people going out of the country and also speaking to people coming back from holiday. The idea of it really is not just about identifying children who are at risk or who may have undergone the practice, but it's also about raising awareness, not just with communities who we believe might be affected, but with everybody. You have doctors, teachers, nurses, etc., coming through the airports who are, you know, really grateful for us being there. And we get a lot of positive feedback from that. So that happens at different airports across the UK. I run one in Birmingham, but there are one at other airports across the UK. I think Dale is online, who I work with at Birmingham Airport, who is a Border Force officer. And Border Force themselves also run their own individual operations. We're also reliant on schools, really. So we've been doing a lot of raising awareness within schools to make sure that they're aware of the signs so that they can alert social services and police. They're concerned about a child who might be leaving the country. They know what to look out for, and therefore we can perhaps get in there before that happens and do an assessment to see whether there is risk there, and if necessary, apply for an FGM protection order. If necessary, ask that they're not able to leave the country if we're not happy they're going to be safe or that parents can protect them. So we are doing quite a bit of active, as well as the reactive stuff around children who are taken abroad. But again, we are reliant on people giving us that information. So again, it's awareness raising as well is a big thing.
Thank you for clarifying that, Jill, and also thank you for moving to different parts of your house to to answer the questions today during the webinar. I received another question, and I think that's a very crucial one as well. Maybe you, Charlotte, could answer that one. It's about the measures that are being taken following an FGMPO. For example, the removal of passports and sometimes a medical check, as you explained during your presentation. Now, what about children's rights and possible children's rights violations? Could you perhaps reflect on those concerns?
Sorry, do you mean a child's right not to be subject to these measures, or
yes, I think that is what's the participant meant, that maybe child rights could be violated by implementing an FGMPO?
Yeah, okay. So FGM protection orders are part of the Children Act 1989. So whenever the court considers whether an FGM protection order should be granted, they have at the forefront of their mind children's rights. So they look at the child's welfare and the child as a paramount consideration. So the whole purpose of these orders is to protect the child. So they wouldn't want to do anything that violates their rights. And I've never, in fact, seen those arguments yet run in court in any event. And as I say, often family members that are applying for these orders to protect girls from risk of FGM from other family members or community members. You also have the advantage in family courts of potentially a children's guardian being appointed, which would mean that a child is independently represented in the family court process. So the child's voice is at the heart of proceedings, and the child's wishes and feelings are considered and taken into account by the court. So the family court will, as I say, have at the forefront of its minds the welfare of the child, perhaps unlike sometimes in immigration jurisdictions or in criminal jurisdictions where obviously it's very different. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think it's very important also that you mentioned who requests for FGMPOs, since sometimes when I'm talking about FGMPOs to my colleagues, the impression is not always that it is family members who actually requests them. So I think it's also important to address that. And I do think that the participant who asked this question, like concerns about medical checks of minors, those concerns exist not only in light of the debate of FGMPOs, but in light of FGM more in general. I also received a question about whether it is necessary that professionals agree with the risk of FGM to grant an FGM protection order. So this is also something we discussed during the first webinar about the role of professionals. Could you perhaps reflect on that?
Is this a question for me, Anna? Or...
Yeah, or to Jill, or to a representative of Forward, perhaps.
What? Or is Lethan available? I wonder if he could
assist. Yeah, Lethan was not in the call when we started. Maybe he joined. Are you?
He's in court, so he wasn't able to make it.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, you cannot join.
Jill could take that question, or I can come back on it.
Yeah, please do.
So, can you repeat the question?
Do you repeat the question, Ellen?
Yes, of course I can. The question is whether it is necessary that professionals agree with the risk of FGM to grant an FGM protection order. And if so, where do these professionals base their risk assessment on? That is the question.
Okay. So, protection order then. The National FGM Centre have a risk assessment, which is available. It's primarily used by social workers, but it helps in making that assessment about whether there is risk there. And that will guide you to whether an FGM protection order is necessary. What I would say is what the court has got to be happy with is that there is a real risk of harm. That's the threshold. There has to be a real risk of harm. And if you can evidence that the child is at real risk of harm, then an order potentially could be granted. Now, I think that the problem is around professionals who understand FGM well enough to be able to make that risk assessment appropriately.
Yes, exactly. I do recognize what you were saying. I also would like to go back to you, to all the participants. Like, are there any legal remedies or other remedies that exist in your countries that are protecting girls at risk, like FGMPOs do in the UK? Are there any similar remedies in your jurisdictions? Is there anything, for example, in Canada, I see some people from other European countries. Is there anything you could perhaps share with us that in a situation that a girl is at risk of FGM, what happens in your countries? Is there any volunteer who wants to share what the rules and regulations and laws or perhaps remedies are? Is there anybody who wants to take the floor and share with us? Okay, I give you a few more minutes to think. And in the meantime, we can continue with our discussion. Anne-Marie Lund, maybe you want to take the floor and explain your session at the airport, following your very interesting remark in the chat box, to speak about FGM and the knowledge. You write that not many people know about FGM being a problem in the UK. Would you like to?
Sorry,
Jill, you want to take the floor?
Yeah, I think I was just typing a reply. I think the situation with awareness is a lot better. My experience when I was dealing with operation at the airport is that many more people now do know about FGM, and many people are expecting actually to see us there at the different times of year that we are there, which again is good because that's a preventative as well, potentially. In terms of professionals, in terms of children, I mean, I've been running Limelight for about 5 years now, and over the last couple of years, we have had more children telling us, oh yes, I learnt about that in school. So schools are beginning to take it on board and are beginning to teach children about what it is so that they can raise alerts to staff if needs be. So I think, yes, we've still got a long way to go, but we are making improvements.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you very much. Leeton, I saw that you joined us. Welcome to our session. I immediately have a question for you, and I would like to ask you to reflect on FGMPOs and reflect maybe on the first webinar, and to share with us what your perspective is as a person working for the National FGM Center. You are a social worker, so what is your perspective on FGMPOs, and how do you think it could help other countries as well if they would implement a remedy like this?
Well, no, I mean, I should start by saying apologies for joining late. I'm actually in court virtually today. I thought it was going to be this morning at 10 o'clock, and I received an email last night saying it was 2 o'clock today.
Don't worry about it. We're happy you're here.
And I haven't received a call from the court as yet, so it might be a possibility I might get a phone call and I will need to take it.
Don't worry, it's okay.
Now, so I would like to start off by saying, based on our experience, FGM protection orders, they are it's something that we needed in this whole arena when we're thinking about FGM and the measures that's available for us in order to protect girls. So that's, for us, it's a plus. I think that one issue is that has happened is around families' awareness or understanding of its existence. So when the local authority, Children's Social Care, apply for an order, and it's done ex parte, meaning that the family isn't there, when the order is granted, obviously it does result in some tensions between professionals and parents, and then it filters down into how communities, the stories that communities will hear about FGM protection orders when they're implemented. Now, in some situations, a local authority can get an order, and as I said, so the family are unaware of it, but it's an interim order and will have an opportunity to go to court to give their evidence, whether or not, for example, if they agree with the order, they want the order to be discharged. So that's a mechanism that's available there for parents. But it's just for some parents as well as obviously the shock of being told that, for example, there's a travel ban or this order is in existence, and how they would feel about that. So I think as well, one reason why for us it's really important is that it kind of like ensures that not only the family here in the UK comes on board, but in the assessments that we do in relation to FGM protection orders, it does involve speaking to families overseas as well. So it's increasing knowledge about the measures that are in existence here in the UK, and raising awareness with families overseas, because families overseas could be named as in the order as well. So that's a plus for us. But one other challenge for FGM protection orders, it's really around when families initially, for example, agree with the order, but 2-3 years down the line, they may feel that things have moved on. So I'll give you an example. So one of our workers did an assessment where the parents were in agreement with the FGM protection order. They accepted that families overseas would present a risk to their child, and they did not feel that they were confident enough to be able to protect that child. And 2-3 years down the line now, 3 years now, the parents are saying, well, they didn't realize that the FGM protection order with the travel ban meant that the child wouldn't be able to travel anywhere. And they just find that it's a bit too restrictive, and they want the order to be discharged. So they have to now do, the local authority do another assessment to assess the parents' ability to be able to protect their child, depending obviously on where they travel to. So the issue as well is not only about country, FGM affected country, but it's about people. Because we can say that, for example, going to Somalia would be a risk, but the family may have relatives, let's say in Holland, and Holland probably would not, in the scheme of things, not considered to be one of those FGM affected countries like Somalia, but they may have people there who may present risk as well. So that could work as a good thing or a bad thing. But in a nutshell, for us, FGM protection orders, they work. Some families, more families that we work with, are much more supportive of it. They see it as a means to protect their daughters, especially if the risk is overseas as well. But there are obviously still tensions with it, and the tensions is not really with the order themselves, but as a way how professionals probably use them, or just the process.
Thank you, Lethan. Thank you so much for clarifying. Many issues you raise are so interesting, and I'm so happy that we can have this discussion, because there are so many different issues at stake, so much experience is already in the UK, which is really, really nice. I have a very important question from Hanan. the question is whether it is easy for non-legally trained individuals or support workers to make an FGMPO application to the court in the UK. Charlotte, Jill, or Lethan, would you like to answer that question, please?
I've seen cases where non-legal parties made applications. I've seen cases and assisted in the background where mothers in particular or family members have applied for FGM protection orders in person without any legal representation whatsoever from the court. And sometimes I think perhaps well, often the court will bend over backwards when you're a litigant in person to try and help and support you. I think particularly in circumstances where FGM is a risk. So I know the courts have been particularly amenable to that. And I've seen examples of other professionals making applications themselves without legal representation as well. So the answer is yes, you can do it. I think it has happened, but perhaps Jill can speak a little bit more about that as a police officer.
Charlotte. Yeah, I think I've just answered in the chat box as well that if it's regarding a child, then we would expect, and the best practice would be for that always to be referred to the multi-agency safeguarding hub. If we've got a risk of a child undergoing FGM, that needs to be reported. There needs to be an assessment. There are wider implications and safeguarding which need to be considered. And the services of both the police and children's services. So yeah, that would be my advice, really.
Thank you, Jill. I have. Oh, sorry, Lethan.
I'd just like to echo what Charlotte said. I've seen cases where the police have applied for the FGM protection order. So it's a wide array of people from different professional backgrounds and non-professional backgrounds as well.
Well, that's important. That's very good to know. Edith also has an excellent question. She says, in Canada, primary care practitioners and Children Aid Society are trying to comply with the duty to report, but most service providers, including schools, are not taking their responsibility seriously. Many service providers, including police, are not aware of the law in place and therefore how to help reinforce it. We are currently conducting awareness campaigns, hence the loopholes. And I think, to my experience, this is a problem in a lot of countries. One of the panelists, would you like to address this issue? Excellent question of Edith. Charlotte, maybe you want to start?
I think the issue of mandatory reporting is one that we struggle with here as well. So along with FGM protection orders, mandatory reporting was introduced in 2015 by frontline practitioners. So for example, social workers, teachers, medical practitioners that discover FGM on girls within the course of their work. And they are supposed to report, but from what I gather, they started off with a fair number of reports after the introduction of legislation, and it slowly, I think, has decreased. And I don't think the reporting that was expected has sort of manifested itself in the statistics that are available. I think when we look at the NHS data set, which shows the numbers of girls that medical practitioners are seeing with FGM, it doesn't appear that all of those cases have perhaps been reported as they should have been. So, I mean, that is an issue, and there are a number of reasons for that. Perhaps Lethan can speak a bit more about the need for reporting and what perhaps some of the issues are, because I know it's an issue that we've discussed.
Yeah, I think with mandatory reporting, when, because there was a consultation, I'm sure, before it was implemented, and the feedback that was given was, because around that same time in the UK, there was a discussion was happening around mandatory reporting for all forms of abuse, and then there is a sexual abuse inquiry that's going on in this discussion about mandatory reporting for professionals in relation to sexual abuse. But research from other jurisdictions where there is mandatory reporting shows that it isn't really that successful at all. Professionals as well find a way to circumvent the system. So there's a lot of tensions with regard to mandatory reporting. But as Charlotte said, you know, it started off where you know, referrals were being made, calls were being made because of you're required to dial to call the police. And I think that that's probably one of the tensions with professionals over here. It's about the mandatory reporting, is about dialing not the 999 emergency number, but another number, it's 101, and reporting your concerns. And I think professionals feel very uncomfortable knowing that you're being forced to pass information on to the police about the families. That's one. We can't not take out of the mix that it's in relation to FGM, obviously, and people feel very uncomfortable about, you know, FGM as an issue, and then having to deal with it, and then having to call the police in relation to FGM. So from my understanding is that the mandatory reporting requirement doesn't work, and it hasn't actually been that successful. There's no consistent data across all police forces that can tell us who's reporting and how many professionals have reported cases of mandatory reporting.
Thank you, Lethan. Jill, you would like to share something as well in relation to mandatory reporting?
Yeah, please. Just to clarify for those who are logged in and listening, that mandatory reporting only applies to where a regulated professional sees what they believe to be FGM. So they actually observe, we're talking about health professionals here, who see what they think in a child, in somebody who's under 18, that they've been cut. Or the child themselves has told that professional directly. Those are the only circumstances that the mandatory reporting apply. I would hope that even without mandatory reporting, that a professional who had received or seen that anyway, or to social services, because it's very clear that something has happened to that child. So I think initially, my opinion of why the figures were heightened initially, and from my own experience within West Midlands Police, is because professionals were unclear of what exactly mandatory reporting was. So we were getting reports of the fair of that unit. So there was a suspicion of FGM, for example. And I think perhaps now, although I don't think mandatory reporting is understood as well as it should be, I don't think we're getting so many of reports which don't fall in within the mandatory reporting. My own experience of cases that we've had come to the West Midlands Police, and bearing in mind we're probably one of the highest behind the Metropolitan Police in reporting figures and cases that we've dealt with, I can probably, within the 10 years that I've been monitoring it, can probably count on one hand the amount of cases that would fit within that mandatory reporting definition. Usually they're about concerns about suspicions about mums had FGM, who's had a daughter that's been born, or things that the children have said that aren't specifically I've been cut, if you know what I mean. And then again, that's another reason we don't have the reports for us to be able to investigate. Another reason why we haven't had those prosecutions is because we don't get that information into us. I don't think it's professionals not reporting to us. I just think they're not told. It's a hidden crime. It's something that kids, communities don't talk about. So we're just not going to be aware of it.
Thank you, Jill. That is a very important contribution. I also have a question from Keela, and we are going to wrap up soon because we already are out of time, but I am really enjoying the conversation, and I think it's good to start a discussion and to share experiences. I think that's really crucial. We have a question from Keila about the situation in Belgium. I will mute some people, sorry. So the question is from Kila. In Belgium, it is possible that the parents sign a document under which they engage not to undergo FGM, but it is not legal. It is associated with medical check. Does it exist in the UK is the question, and does it take into account in FGMPO? So maybe Charlotte or Lethan or Jill, do you want to answer that question? Do you have something like that in the UK? I could say that in the Netherlands we do have a similar situation. But does it also exist in the UK? Parents signing a document under which they engage not to undergo FGM.
Before FGM protection orders were introduced, I did see examples of the police or social services, children's services I should say, inviting the family to sign a document that they wouldn't perform FGM and that being advised it's illegal and the consequences if they did perform FGM. I haven't seen any examples of that, certainly from my legal cases post FGM protection orders, but it's unlikely the document itself would have any legal effect if it's not registered within the court. So for example, if it's not a court order that's signed by consent, then it wouldn't have any legal footing. But perhaps Lethan can speak a little bit more about that given his work as a social worker.
I'm sorry, Charlotte, just to clarify, you have not seen this, right? You haven't?
No, I haven't seen it. Not since FGM protection orders were introduced in 2015. Prior to that, I had seen examples of police officers and social workers asking families to sign a document to confirm they wouldn't perform FGM, and they were aware that it was illegal. But my opinion, even if that was signed, it wouldn't have any legal status because it's not being registered in a family court.
No, exactly.
But perhaps Lethan can speak about his experience as a social worker.
Right. Well, we call them written agreements. So before FGM, we started to focus on FGM. Written agreements used to be used with parents on any issue. So let's say it's physical abuse that was happening, and the parent will sign an agreement stating that they would no longer hit the child. They would present the child to be medically examined if concerns raised. But Charlotte is right. It wasn't. They're not legally binding at all, and it's a practice that's actually stopped by most local authorities that I'm aware of. Don't use written agreements anymore because some of the conditions of these written agreements was actually breaching parents' rights as well, the rights of the child as well. And in one local authority, they were using them in relation to FGM. And there was a review that was done of that local authority's practices with regard to preventing or protecting girls from being cut. And what resulted was that the use of the written agreements by that local authority was considered to be poor practice. So it's something that that local authorities will shy away from using in relation to FGM. If you have concerns about the welfare of a child, there are other measures that can be taken. I mean, FGM protection orders are one. You could, no, that's not the court. Sorry, let me put. Yeah, yes, and the other mechanisms within the child protection system here in the UK that you can use to protect girls instead of using written agreements.
Thank you for that clarification. Kayla, do you maybe want to take the floor quickly and explain what exactly happens in Belgium? If you're willing to share and if you're still with us.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Yes, it's just my concern. It's sometimes these documents in Belgium, we use that to allow parents to travel with their kids. And it's true that it's not legally binding, but many prosecutors use them. It's like, it's a prevention. It's a prevention. And as you said, they help to remind the law, but you're right, we don't have any guarantee. If, yes, and that's a problem. But we don't really have the measure, the order. It doesn't really exist in Belgium. It's a normal procedure, and it could be long. You know, you can, and so it's why I think it could be interesting to have this kind of measure in Belgium to protect the kids. But it's just that my concern is that it means that the kids could never travel until the majority out of the country, as Lytton said. That's just, for many people, it's quite, yes, it's disproportionate. But it's true that the priority, it's the protection of the kids, of the children. But for many people, because I have a case, and finally the parents signed these agreements, and the prosecutor allowed them to travel to Guinea. You know, it's also a high prevalence FGM country, but just with these and the medical check, they were allowed to travel to the country.
So if I understand you correctly, and the parents need to sign this agreement, then they are allowed to travel, and when they come back to Belgium, there is a medical check to see
yes,
if they lived up to the agreement.
Yes, and with there is also in these agreements, there are also of course they remind the legal consequence and criminal the consequence in the case of FGM, and so it's but it's true that it's not legally binding. That's also my concern. It's not legally binding, but for us it's a way to prevent, but also to allow people to travel, because they give enough guarantees.
Yeah. Well, it's actually the very same situation in the Netherlands at the very moment. I think the situation is very similar.
Yes.
In a lot of European countries, sorry to jump in, but yeah, these FGM, stop FGM passport or statements against FGM are the most common.
Yes.
You know, they're also in Germany, in Spain. Yeah, so it's and maybe they're not legally binding. They are just an agreement with the families. Yeah.
But so it's better for us. Is it better to have this proposition of FGMPO? That's my question, because yes, I think yes, but many people will raise concerns about the fact that the family could never travel to the country. That's just yes.
I think that is the balance that many governments and states in the EU and other Western countries are trying to strike, right? On the one hand, you don't want to allow parents to take their girls who are at risk of FGM to their countries of origin, especially in the summer holidays. You want to prevent FGM from happening, but at the same time, the parents that do not intend to have their daughters cut, you don't want to limit their freedom of movement and their ability to visit friends and family. So this is, I think, the struggle that many countries have, and I believe that FGMPOs are an excellent way of protecting girls at risk, but also safeguarding other rights. And therefore, I really enjoy this discussion. I think it's great to have so many interactions. We still have quite some questions in the chat box, but we're also running out of time, and I don't want to take more of your time. I don't know if any of the panelists want to share a final thought or want to say some final words before I hand over the floor back to you, Chiara. Maybe.
Sorry, thank you, Anne-Marie. I'll just say finally, I hope that for people that are not familiar with FGM protection orders, or even those that are, have found this beneficial, at least in learning what other legal remedies are available in the UK and could potentially be implemented in other countries. I think it would be really helpful to understand what's happening in other jurisdictions. And we've heard, from some examples in Portugal and Canada and Belgium and other countries. But I think, it's certainly learning about what's happening abroad would no doubt facilitate our understanding and whether FGM protection orders could be complementary in your jurisdiction in preventing FGM from taking place. So I'd encourage you to write to Chiara at the End EU FGM network and to share your observations and your thoughts. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand over to Jill Squires.
Thanks, Charlotte. Just in closing, really, I think one of the threads that has run through both webinars really has been about the lack of awareness of professionals and communities. And I think it's really important that we all kind of take responsibility for raising that awareness and encouraging others to do so as well. I know probably my friends on Facebook, not that I'm on there very much, probably seeing things around FGM, forced marriage, on based on there, and we can share it all, so we can all do our bit in FGM and to raise that awareness of protection orders and the fact that we need to safeguard that we're also balancing that on human rights as well, and referring into children's services who can make.
Thank you, Jill. Lethan, some final words from you.
Right. Just a couple of points on what was just said. You know, with regard to, I mean, written agreements. I think that the danger is at times is that written agreements could be a false positive. It can give us some sense of hope that the parent is working in partnership. And from our experience of using written agreements in other situations, is that it does just that. We think that we're working with the parent, and they've signed a written agreement when it's about disguised compliance, showing that they're trying to work with us when the truth is that they're not really working with us as well. So just to be careful of false positives. And it's important to remember with FGM protection orders, they can be varied. So if circumstances change, the parents could ask to return to court to have the conditions of the order amended, or for the order to be discharged as well. I would like to echo what Jill said, awareness. For this to be successful, awareness, it's really important with communities and also amongst professionals as well. And it can't be for a time-limited period. It's an ongoing process of increasing awareness, and also what should be tied into if jurisdictions are going to implement FGM protection orders. It's about capturing the data to obtain learning about the order, about how useful the orders are across the board. And it's really important as well for us to remain child focused. And finally, it just really just like to thank the organizers, because it's just really a good opportunity to learn about what others are doing as well, and for us to share our learning around how we use FGM protection orders. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lethan. And I also would like to take the opportunity to thank the amazing panelists. I also want to thank Chiara for co-organizing this. I think this is so important. It's great to have those discussions. It's very interesting to learn also what is happening in European countries. I hope we can continue the discussion in the upcoming weeks and months. And I hand over to you, Chiara.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you. I just want to echo, thank you, everyone. Thank you for your participation. Thank you to the speakers. I think it was really important to give us a bit of extra time to discuss and to really enrich the amazing presentations that came out of last webinar, really with concrete examples and with concrete really cases from other countries, but also to understand better how it works in the UK. So just from our side as NFGM European Network, we are really very committed to ensuring an equal protection for all women and girls, no matter where they live. So again, I would like to reiterate that we are working towards this, and we, in our work, we are mapping what happens at different countries, and then so at the end of the year, we will have an interactive map on our website on all different legal policy services and data in the countries where we have members. So this will come, we will share it with you, but of course the protection and these legal tools will be a part of that. So we hope to capture really the big picture, and I'm sure we will continue this conversation and in the future, and really to ensure that we have a common protection for all women and girls living in our region, let's say. So thank you very much. We will share the recording, we will share the PowerPoints as last time, and please keep in touch. And if you, as Charlotte was saying, if you feel free to write to me with your questions or even cases, and we will make sure to send them to around and to collect them for future discussion and debate. Thank you so much, and have a lovely afternoon and a weekend soon. Bye. Take care.